The poster said they were coming to destroy what was left of the Netherlands. Civilians hiding in cellars believed it. Entire cities believed it because the alternative, hope, had been systematically starved out of them over 5 months of deliberate famine. But when the convoys appeared on the horizon that April morning in 1945, what arrived wasn't destruction. It was food. Chocolate and canned meat handed out by soldiers who looked more exhausted than cruel. And it was the beginning of a gratitude so profound that nearly 81 years later, it still blooms every spring in a foreign capital, thousands of tulips at a time. This is the story of how Canadians didn't just liberate a country, they earned its lasting friendship, and how that friendship became one of the most enduring traditions born from World War II. Before we continue with the full story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, what city and country. We read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a winter that tried to kill an entire nation. The Hongerwinter of 1944 to 1945 was a deliberately engineered famine used as a weapon of war. When the Dutch government in exile called for a railway strike in September 1944 to support Allied operations, the German response was calculated and cruel. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi Reichskommissar, ordered a complete food embargo on the Western Netherlands. No food in, no food out. 3.5 million people trapped in a deliberate starvation campaign. By November, the rations had dropped to roughly 1,000 calories a day. By December, to around 800. By February 1945, some areas were receiving in some places to only a few hundred calories daily. For context, that level is consistent with extreme starvation. And unlike concentration camps, this was happening to an entire civilian population, including children, elderly, pregnant women. Over 22,000 people died before liberation came. The Dutch were eating tulip bulbs, not as a delicacy. As the difference between life and death, you had to boil them twice. The first water contained toxins that would make you violently ill. You threw that water away, even though throwing away anything that might have calories felt like a crime against survival. The second boiling produced a bitter, starchy paste that your body could process. Barely. People stripped trees for bark, dug up flower gardens for roots, burned furniture for warmth because there was no coal, no wood, nothing. The city of Amsterdam looked stripped and hollowed out. Every tree gone. Houses with missing walls where residents had torn them apart for firewood. Streets empty except for the occasional figure moving with the slow, deliberate shuffle of advanced starvation. The children stopped growing. The elderly simply stopped. Young women's menstrual cycles ceased as their bodies shut down non-essential functions to preserve life. Men's bodies consumed their own muscle tissue. Everyone's hair started falling out. In Ottawa, Canada, Princess Juliana of the Netherlands was watching this happen to her country from thousands of miles away. She had fled to Canada in 1940 with her daughters after the German invasion. The Canadian government had offered sanctuary, and she had accepted, establishing a government in exile while her nation suffered under occupation. Her youngest daughter, Margaret, had been born in Ottawa Civic Hospital on January 19, 1943. In an extraordinary gesture, the Canadian government had temporarily declared the maternity ward extraterritorial, meaning technically not Canadian soil, so that Margriet would be born exclusively Dutch and maintain her place in the royal succession. It was a legal fiction done out of respect and friendship, and for ordinary Canadians, her presence in Ottawa wasn't just a diplomatic detail. People donated to relief efforts, attended events, and followed Dutch news as if it were partly their own. In a country with deep ties to Europe, the Dutch royal family's exile made the war feel less distant. It helped turn an overseas conflict into something personal, something that later would make the story of the tulips resonate far beyond politics. Princess Juliana had every reason to be grateful to Canada even before the liberation. But gratitude and guilt are close cousins, and she carried both. Her people were dying while she was safe. Her country was being systematically destroyed while she lived in comfort. The emotional weight of that exile was crushing. She listened to every radio report, read every intelligence briefing, maintained constant communication with resistance networks inside the Netherlands, and when the reports about the Hongerwinter started coming through in late 1944, the numbers were so horrific that she initially thought they were exaggerated. They weren't. If anything, the reality was worse than the reports suggested. By April 1945, the situation had become so desperate that even the Nazi occupiers were concerned, not out of humanitarian compassion, but because mass starvation was creating disease conditions that might spread to German troops. The Wehrmacht was losing the war badly enough without dealing with typhoid and dysentery epidemics. The 1st Canadian Army had been fighting its way across the Netherlands since late March. This was the same army that had earned a fearsome reputation for tactical effectiveness throughout the war. Canadian forces had pioneered innovative assault tactics at Vimy Ridge in World War I that military historians still study today. In World War II, they had proven themselves as elite shock troops capable of breaking through heavily defended positions. But what they were about to attempt in the Netherlands was something entirely different, something that would require precision, trust, and an almost unthinkable level of risk. General Charles Foulkes commanded the 1st Canadian Army operations in the Netherlands. He was a methodical, careful officer who understood that liberating starving civilians required different tactics than defeating armed enemies. You couldn't just roll tanks through cities where people were too weak to get out of the way. The original plan called for a full military assault to clear German forces from the Western Netherlands, but that plan would have taken weeks, and the Dutch didn't have weeks. They had days, maybe. The death rate was accelerating as spring weather made disease spread faster. On April 28, 1945, an extraordinary agreement was reached. The Germans would allow Allied aircraft to drop food supplies over Dutch cities without being shot at. In exchange, the Allies would temporarily halt their military advance into certain areas. It was a truce based on mutual recognition that mass civilian death served nobody's strategic interests. Operation Manna was the British codename. Operation Chowhound was the American version. Both operations involved heavy bombers, the same aircraft that had been dropping high explosives on German cities for years, now loaded with food instead of bombs. The first drops happened on April 29th. Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers, massive 4-engine aircraft, flew at dangerously low altitudes over Dutch cities. Bomb bay doors opened. Instead of ordnance, wooden crates tumbled out attached to parachutes. Each crate contained emergency rations, canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, dried fruit, coffee, cigarettes, sugar, flour, the basics of survival, delivered from the sky like a desperate prayer being answered. The Dutch flooded into the streets to watch. People who hadn't left their homes in weeks suddenly found the energy to run outside, following the parachutes as they drifted down. Children who'd forgotten how to laugh were laughing. Adults were crying. Some people just stood in the streets with their arms raised toward the sky, weeping. In the city of Rotterdam, a Lancaster bomber flew so low that people could see the crew members waving from the windows. The pilot waggled his wings in greeting before pulling up and banking away. The crowd below waved back, thousands of skeletal hands raised in gratitude and disbelief. Over the next 9 days, the Allies flew nearly 3,000 sorties. They dropped over 11,000 tons of food. The bombers came in waves, sometimes dozens at a time, filling the sky with aircraft and parachutes and hope. It was strategically risky, flying heavy bombers at low altitude in broad daylight over territory that still contained German anti-aircraft positions. A single breakdown in discipline could have turned it into tragedy. A misunderstanding could have ended the truce. It didn't happen. The truce held. The food fell, people ate. The death rate slowed, then stopped climbing, then began to drop. To understand why that mattered, imagine what 9 days of calories can do in a famine. It doesn't fix starvation, but it buys time. Time for the weakest to stabilize, time for hospitals to function, time for sanitation to improve, time for a society to keep its grip. And it brought something harder to measure: morale. When people saw parachutes, they saw proof that someone, somewhere, still considered their lives worth saving. In wars, that kind of proof can be as important as any supply convoy. But Operation Manna was an emergency measure, a stopgap. The real liberation required boots on the ground, required the 1st Canadian Army to actually enter the cities and secure them, required face-to-face contact between liberators and liberated. And when that contact happened, it would shatter every lie the Nazi propaganda machine had told. That contact happened in early May. The Canadians entered Dutch cities carefully, tactically, professionally. They didn't know what to expect. The intelligence reports about the starvation were clear, but reading about hunger and seeing it in person are two different experiences. What they saw shocked even combat-hardened veterans. Walking skeletons was a phrase that appeared in multiple soldiers' diaries and letters home. Not people who were thin, not people who looked malnourished, walking skeletons, people whose bodies had consumed everything that could be consumed, leaving only the absolute minimum tissue required to keep vital organs functioning. Children with enormous eyes and stick-thin limbs, elderly people who looked ancient at 50, young women whose faces showed every bone in their skulls, men who could barely walk, their leg muscles so depleted that movement required intense concentration and effort. The Canadians had brought rations, military rations meant for soldiers, but they started handing them out immediately. Orders be damned, regulations be damned. These people needed food, and the Canadians had food, and the math was simple. In later accounts, a Canadian corporal wrote words to the effect of, "I gave my chocolate ration to a child today. She looked at it like it was gold. Her mother cried. I cried too. What kind of war does this to children?" The distribution quickly became organized, and it had to be organized carefully. After months of starvation, you can't simply hand people unlimited food and expect them to recover overnight. Canadian medical officers warned about what we now call refeeding complications. A body that has been running on almost nothing can react badly to sudden rich meals. So the help came with triage, broths and small portions for the weakest, steady calories for those stable enough, and medical attention for infections that hunger had made deadly. It was wartime medicine mixed with basic human care, done in town squares and makeshift clinics, often by people who had trained for battle, not famine relief. Canadian quartermasters set up food stations in town squares. Medical officers assessed who needed immediate treatment versus who could safely eat solid food. Soldiers who'd been fighting for weeks suddenly found themselves running humanitarian operations, and they adapted with the same efficiency they'd shown in combat. But something else was happening alongside the food distribution, something the Canadians hadn't expected and the Dutch had been too afraid to hope for. Connection, human connection, recognition of shared humanity. The propaganda had been vicious. The Germans had spent months telling the Dutch that the Canadians were barely civilized, that liberation would mean occupation by forces who would loot and assault and destroy what little remained. Some Dutch civilians had believed it. When you're starving and terrified, your capacity for critical thinking diminishes. You believe what you're told because questioning requires energy you don't have. That's why the first impressions mattered so much. In many towns, the very first Canadian a family encountered became the Canadians in their memory. If that first interaction had been careless or cruel, the story might have curdled into resentment. Instead, again and again, the first encounter was help. A ration shared, a gentle word, a medic's attention, a soldier taking time to explain with hand gestures that the danger was over. Those early minutes rewrote months of fear. So when the Canadians arrived, some civilians hid. Expected violence, expected cruelty, expected the worst. What they got was soldiers sharing their personal rations despite being exhausted and hungry themselves. What they got was medics treating sick children with the same care they'd give their own families. What they got was engineers repairing water systems and electrical grids without being asked. What they got was ordinary human kindness from people who had every right to be hardened and cruel after years of war. A Canadian private named James McKinnon from Nova Scotia spent 3 hours helping an elderly Dutch couple repair their roof. He didn't speak Dutch. They didn't speak English. They communicated through gestures and shared labor, and by the end, they were friends. The couple invited him for dinner. They had almost nothing to serve, but they served it anyway, and McKinnon ate it and thanked them in broken Dutch, and they all understood exactly what was being exchanged. Not just food, dignity. Recognition, humanity. This pattern repeated across dozens of cities and towns. Canadian soldiers and Dutch civilians, supposedly separated by language and culture and the brutal logic of war, finding ways to connect, to help each other, to rebuild not just buildings but trust. In the town of Wageningen, negotiations for the official German surrender were happening while Canadian soldiers were teaching Dutch children how to play baseball in the street. The juxtaposition was surreal. History being made in a formal meeting room while kids who'd nearly starved to death were learning how to swing a bat and run bases. The formal surrender of German forces in the Netherlands was signed on May 5, 1945. It covered German troops across the country, making it one of the largest localized surrenders of the war in Europe. Liberation Day. That's what it became known as, Bevrijdingsdag in Dutch. Every year since, May 5th is celebrated across the Netherlands with festivals, concerts, ceremonies. It's a national holiday on par with Christmas or New Year's. Children get the day off school. Cities hold massive public celebrations. The entire country stops to remember. And in those celebrations, Canada is always mentioned, always honored, always remembered. Because what the Canadians did wasn't just military victory, it was something rarer and more valuable. It was decency under conditions that didn't require decency. It was choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier. It was seeing people as people instead of as obstacles or objects. The liberation created immediate bonds, but those bonds deepened over the following months. Canadian soldiers were stationed across the Netherlands through the summer and fall of 1945. They helped rebuild infrastructure, provided security as the country reorganized, assisted with the massive logistical challenge of returning displaced persons to their homes, helped hunt down remaining Nazi collaborators and war criminals. During those months, relationships developed, friendships, romances, connections that crossed cultural and linguistic barriers, because shared experience and shared trauma create understanding faster than any language class. By the end of 1945, Dutch women and Canadian soldiers were getting married at a rate that required both governments to establish bureaucratic systems to process the applications. Medical examinations, background checks, immigration paperwork, marriage verification. Behind those documents were very ordinary questions with extraordinary stakes. Where will we live? Will my family ever see me again? What language will our children speak? Many Dutch brides were leaving parents who had only just survived the Hongerwinter. Some carried a single suitcase and a handful of photographs. Some carried recipes, stitched into notebooks, because food in memory can be a form of home. Here's a short composite drawn from multiple war bride accounts. A young woman stands on a dock, holding a paper cup of tea she can't taste because her throat is too tight. Her husband squeezes her hand. He's nervous too, trying to be brave in a way soldiers learn. When the ship's horn sounds, she doesn't cry loudly. She simply turns once more toward the shoreline, as if looking hard enough could keep it from slipping away. Then she faces the ocean. That's what rebuilding looks like when you're 19 or 20. One step forward, carrying both grief and hope. The numbers tell the story. Over the course of 1945 and 1946, more than 1,800 Dutch women married Canadian soldiers and emigrated to Canada. 1,886 families created from the rubble of war. 1,886 personal stories of connection emerging from collective tragedy. Among the Canadian liberators were Indigenous soldiers, whose presence had been the subject of particularly vicious propaganda. The Germans had warned Dutch civilians about these men, called them savages, said they were ghost snipers who took scalps and showed no mercy. The propaganda posters had been explicitly designed to terrify, portraying Indigenous soldiers as monsters in uniform. The reality, when Dutch civilians encountered these soldiers in person, shattered those lies completely. These men were among the most skilled and professional soldiers in the Canadian forces. Many had enlisted despite facing discrimination at home, serving a country that often treated them as second-class citizens. They'd proven themselves in combat through exceptional marksmanship, tactical intelligence, and courage under fire. And when they entered Dutch cities, they showed the same kindness and professionalism as every other Canadian soldier, sharing rations with starving children, helping repair damaged homes, treating liberated civilians with dignity and respect. That chapter deserves its own full video, both for what Indigenous soldiers contributed overseas and for what many faced when they returned home. If you want that episode next, comment Indigenous veterans and I'll prioritize it. Princess Juliana returned to the Netherlands on May 2, 1945, 3 days before the official surrender. 1945, 3 days before the official surrender. She had spent nearly 5 years in exile, safe in Canada, while her country suffered. The weight of that safety, the guilt of it, was profound. She was determined to express gratitude in a way that would last beyond her lifetime. In 1945, she sent 100,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa. 100,000. Not a symbolic gesture, but a transformative gift, enough to fill entire parks and gardens across the city. The bulbs were planted throughout Ottawa, in front of government buildings, around Parliament, in public spaces. When they bloomed in spring 1946, they created a spectacle of colour, seas of red and yellow and pink. Holland's national symbol, growing in Canada's capital, visible evidence of gratitude and friendship. But Princess Juliana, who became Queen Juliana following her mother's abdication in 1948, didn't want this to be temporary. She wanted it to become tradition, something that would outlast her generation, outlast anyone who personally remembered the war. So the Netherlands established an annual commitment. Every year, tulip bulbs would be sent to Ottawa. The number eventually standardized at a large annual shipment of bulbs that has continued for decades, through the Cold War, through political changes in both countries, through economic challenges and cultural shifts and everything else that might have disrupted it. The tulips keep coming. Every year, every spring, they bloom. The Canadian Tulip Festival, officially established in 1953, has grown into one of the largest tulip festivals in the world. Over 300,000 tulips bloom across Ottawa every May. Millions of visitors attend. It generates significant tourism revenue and has become part of Ottawa's cultural identity. But at its core, it remains about gratitude, about remembering, about a promise made decades ago to never forget who helped when help was desperately needed. There's a specific section of the festival called the Gift of Tulips display. It features the 20,000 bulbs sent annually by the Netherlands, planted in formations that often incorporate both Canadian and Dutch symbols. Red tulips arranged in maple leaf shapes, orange tulips spelling out messages of thanks. Every year on Liberation Day, ceremonies are held. Dutch and Canadian officials attend. Members of the Dutch royal family sometimes visit. And the same truth is acknowledged. What happened in 1945 created bonds that have proven unbreakable across nearly 8 decades. The Canadian War Museum in Ottawa has an extensive exhibit dedicated to the liberation of the Netherlands. Letters from Dutch civilians thanking specific Canadian soldiers, photographs of the food drops, artifacts from war brides who made the journey to Canada, video testimonies from survivors, recorded before they died, preserving their stories. One survivor, recorded in her late 80s, described the moment she first saw Canadian soldiers. "I was so hungry I couldn't think straight. My brother had already died. It was just my mother and me, and we were both dying. Then the Canadians came. A soldier gave me chocolate. I'd forgotten what chocolate tasted like. I cried so hard I couldn't even eat it at first. My mother had to help me." That soldier saved my life. I never learned his name, but I've thought about him every single day since, every single day. Survivors consistently describe similar experiences. The profound shock of kindness after months of cruelty. The cognitive dissonance of receiving help from people they'd been taught to fear. The lasting impact of small gestures, chocolate bars and shared rations that literally meant the difference between life and death. That's what gratitude looks like across decades. Not abstract appreciation, but concrete memory of specific moments when strangers chose compassion. The military achievements of the 1st Canadian Army during the Netherlands campaign were substantial. They liberated the Western Netherlands in a matter of weeks, while simultaneously providing humanitarian relief, which should have slowed operations but didn't due to exceptional coordination and discipline. They accepted the surrender of tens of thousands of German soldiers, with minimal additional civilian casualties. They restored order, prevented reprisal killings, maintained strict discipline, and treated defeated enemies with the same professionalism they showed to liberated civilians. It was a demonstration of military operations conducted with both tactical skill and moral clarity. The kind of campaign that gets studied in military academies, not just for effectiveness, but for ethical conduct under complex circumstances. Canadian casualties during the Netherlands campaign were significant. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. Young men from across Canada who died liberating a country they'd never seen before for people they'd never met because it was strategically necessary and morally right. The Netherlands remembers them. Canadian war cemeteries across the Netherlands are maintained with meticulous care. Dutch volunteers, many of them children during the war, adopted individual graves decades ago. They visit regularly, leave flowers, learn about the soldiers buried there. Some Dutch families have maintained the same Canadian soldier's grave for 3 generations, passing the responsibility from grandparent to child. In some families, the soldier's name becomes as familiar as a relative's. Children are told, "This is who helped us." They learn the hometown on the headstone, trace it on a map, and grow up with a quiet sense that the world is bigger than their village and that decency can travel across it. On anniversaries, they bring fresh flowers. On rainy days, they wipe the stone dry. It's not a grand gesture, but it's steady, and steadiness is how memory survives. At Groesbeek Canadian War Cemetery, the largest Canadian military cemetery in Europe with over 2,600 graves, the maintenance is impeccable. The grass is always cut, the headstones are always clean, the flowers are always fresh. It's maintained by the Dutch people and the Dutch government as a sacred responsibility. Every year on Remembrance Day, November 11th, Dutch schoolchildren visit. They place flowers on graves. They read the names aloud. They learn Canadian geography by finding out where these soldiers came from. They write letters to Canadian schools, creating connections with children their own age, continuing relationships their great-grandparents started. This isn't performative. This is genuine institutionalized gratitude that has been deliberately transmitted across 4 generations. The Netherlands made a conscious national decision to never forget, and they've maintained that commitment with remarkable consistency. The tulip tradition is the most visible symbol, but it's not the only expression of this enduring relationship. There are streets in Dutch cities named after Canadian provinces and cities, parks named after Canadian military units, monuments and memorials scattered across the country, educational exchange programs between Canadian and Dutch schools, military partnerships between the Canadian Armed Forces and the Royal Netherlands Armed Forces, cultural festivals, sister city arrangements. All of it traces back to those weeks in April and May 1945, when hungry people were fed, dying people were saved, and an entire nation was liberated, not just from occupation, but from the very real possibility of extinction through starvation. But perhaps the most profound legacy isn't visible in monuments or festivals. It lives in the families that wouldn't exist without those 17 days. The war brides who made the journey to Canada carried these stories with them. They told their children about the Hongerwinter, about eating tulip bulbs boiled twice to remove the poison, about the terror of propaganda and the relief of reality, about choosing to leave everything they knew for a country they'd never seen because the soldiers who liberated them demonstrated what that country valued. Their children grew up understanding that their very existence was directly connected to historical events that seemed distant, but were actually just 1 generation removed. That they were alive because Canadians had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. That their family trees branched in unexpected directions because of chocolate bars and shared rations, and young men who treated strangers like human beings deserving of dignity. Some of those children and grandchildren have made pilgrimages back to the Netherlands, standing in town squares where their mothers or grandmothers first encountered Canadian soldiers, visiting houses now rebuilt or restored where their family stories began, attending Liberation Day ceremonies and feeling the weight of gratitude that still permeates everything. One descendant of a war bride described attending a Liberation Day ceremony decades after the war. "Everyone seemed to know why I was there. They saw my age, heard my accent, and they understood. Strangers came up to thank me, not for anything I'd done, but for existing, for being evidence that the connection between our countries created something lasting. It was overwhelming. That's the legacy. Not just in grand institutional gestures like 20,000 tulips or massive public festivals, but in individual moments of recognition, connection, shared memory. In the understanding that what happens during war doesn't stay contained in those years. It echoes forward through generations, shaping families and cultures and international relationships in ways that can't always be predicted, but can definitely be honored. The children who received chocolate from Canadian soldiers in 1945 are in their 80s and 90s now. Many have passed away. The soldiers who handed out those rations are nearly all gone. The generation that experienced the Hongerwinter and the liberation firsthand is disappearing. But they made sure the memory wouldn't disappear with them. They told their children. Their children told their children. Dutch schools teach about the liberation as a defining moment in national history. Canadian schools teach about it as one of their country's finest military achievements. Museums in both countries preserve artifacts, letters, photographs, testimonies, and every spring, the tulips bloom. In Ottawa, preparations for the Tulip Festival begin months in advance. Gardeners plan the layouts, decide which colors will go where, create designs that honor both Dutch and Canadian heritage. The 20,000 bulbs sent from the Netherlands are planted with special care, often in the most prominent locations. When they bloom in May, they create waves of color across the city. Commissioners Park, Majors Hill Park, Dow's Lake. Hundreds of thousands of tulips transforming Ottawa into something that looks more like Amsterdam than a Canadian capital. Families come to see them. In the parks, you can hear multiple languages at once: English and French, Dutch accents, tourists pointing cameras, kids chasing each other between rows they're told not to step on. The air smells like spring water and fresh earth. Local bakeries lean into it: stroopwafels, poffertjes, maple treats side by side. It's cheerful, almost light, until you remember that this celebration began as a thank you for food dropped from bombers to people who were starving to death. That contrast is part of what makes the festival feel different from any other. It's joy with a memory underneath. Tourists travel from across North America and beyond. Photographers capture images that get shared millions of times on social media. Street vendors sell tulip-themed merchandise. Musicians perform. Food trucks serve Dutch treats alongside Canadian favorites. It's become a celebration that blends cultures, a festival that belongs equally to both countries, even though it happens in only one. But during the opening ceremonies, when officials from both nations speak, the tone shifts from celebration to remembrance. The Dutch ambassador always attends. Sometimes members of the Dutch royal family make the journey. Canadian officials, often including the Prime Minister, participate, and they tell the story. Not every detail, not the full 40-minute documentary version, but the essential truth that Canada helped save the Netherlands when salvation seemed impossible, that the Netherlands has never forgotten, that gratitude can last longer than any political alliance or economic partnership, that some bonds transcend the circumstances that created them. There's a moment during these ceremonies, often captured by cameras and replayed on news broadcasts, when whatever Canadian veterans are still alive and able to attend are recognized. The crowd stands, applauds. The applause continues for minutes, building in intensity rather than fading. The veterans, old men now, often in wheelchairs or using walkers, are usually overwhelmed by the response. Some cry. Many struggle to comprehend that something they did 8 decades ago, when they were teenagers, or young men barely out of school, still matters this much to this many people. But it does matter. It matters to the Dutch Canadians whose parents or grandparents made that journey across the ocean. It matters to Dutch citizens who visit Canada and see the tulips and feel a connection to a country that most of them have never lived in. It matters to Canadian families who learn their grandfather or great-grandfather helped liberate the Netherlands and discover that his service is still remembered and honored. It matters because it's rare. Because most military campaigns, even successful ones, fade from collective memory within a generation or two. Because gratitude, genuine lasting gratitude between nations, is uncommon enough to be precious. The Netherlands made a choice. deliberately and consciously to institutionalize gratitude, to make remembering a matter of national policy and cultural identity, to ensure that future generations who would never experience occupation or liberation or starvation would still understand what was done for their country and by whom. That choice required effort, required resources, required convincing successive governments and generations that this mattered enough to maintain indefinitely. They succeeded. Nearly 80 years later, the tradition is as strong as it's ever been. Stronger perhaps because it survived long enough to prove it wasn't just immediate post-war emotion, but something genuinely fundamental to Dutch national identity. In the Netherlands, Canadian flags fly on Liberation Day alongside Dutch flags. Canadian veterans who visit are treated like heroes, regardless of their age or the decades since they served. Canadian tourists are welcomed with extra warmth when locals learn where they're from. The connection is real, tangible, maintained, and it runs both ways. In Canada, there's special affection for the Netherlands and Dutch culture. Dutch immigrants have integrated into Canadian society while maintaining cultural traditions. Dutch foods, Dutch customs, Dutch festivals have become part of the Canadian multicultural landscape. The relationship isn't just governmental or official, it's personal and cultural. Part of that comes from the war brides and their families. 1,886 women who brought Dutch language, Dutch cooking, Dutch traditions into Canadian homes and communities, who raised children who felt connected to both countries, who created a living bridge between two nations that geography should keep separate, but history has bound together. Their stories are being collected now, archived before the last generation with living memory disappears. Libraries and museums in both countries have oral history projects recording testimonies from war brides or their children, preserving recipes, photographs, letters, the small personal artifacts that make history tangible. Because there's an urgency now that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. The people who can say, "I was there," or "I remember my mother telling me," are in their 80s and 90s. In another decade, maybe two, they'll all be gone. But the tulips will remain. The ceremonies will continue. The tradition will persist even after everyone with personal memory has passed away. That's what makes this extraordinary. The Netherlands and Canada have successfully created institutional and cultural memory that transcends living memory. They've built something designed to last not just decades, but centuries. Whether it actually will last centuries remains to be seen. But 8 decades is already remarkable. 8 decades of sending flowers across an ocean. 8 decades of ceremonies and speeches and gratitude. 8 decades of maintaining a friendship based on events most current citizens of both countries only know from history books. It works because both countries have committed to it. Because the Netherlands keeps sending the tulips and Canada keeps planting them and celebrating them. Because both nations teach their children why this matters. Because the story gets retold year after year to new audiences who need to hear it. And because the story itself is worth retelling. It's a story about the worst of humanity, systematic starvation as a weapon of war, and the best of humanity, kindness shown when it wasn't required or expected. It's about propaganda defeated by reality, about strangers becoming friends, then family, about young men far from home choosing to be decent when they could have been cruel. It's about chocolate bars and parachutes full of food and soldiers helping repair roofs and children learning to laugh again. About marriages that crossed continents and cultures that blended and traditions that emerged from trauma. It's about choosing to remember, choosing to be grateful, choosing to maintain connection even when it would be easier to let it fade. Every spring when the first tulips begin to bloom in Ottawa, the city turns briefly into a living memorial, color and beauty rooted in a very hard truth. The Germans said the Canadians were coming to destroy what was left of the Netherlands. They were wrong. The Canadians arrived with discipline and with compassion, and the Dutch answered with a tradition that still crosses the ocean. That is the true story behind the tulips of gratitude. Not only what happened, but what it became, and what it still means